We live in a hyper-partisan age. These days, people seem to identify with political parties and political movements even more than they do with their favorite football team. And that's remarkable for something that's really just a voluntary association, which is what political parties are. The government doesn't create political parties, people do. They're essentially private clubs. In most democratic constitutions, political parties aren't even mentioned. And yet they've become an integral part of nearly every functioning democracy. Frustration with political parties is nothing new. The American founding fathers absolutely hated them. In his farewell address, George Washington, the first president of the United States, famously warned the young country that political parties would enable cunning, ambitious, unprincipled men to subvert the power of the people and usurp for themselves the reins of government. John Adams, the second president, said that the division of society into political parties should be dreaded as the greatest of political evils. Despite warnings like these, political parties have become important, unavoidable features of democratic government. Well, today we'll take a closer look at political parties. We'll talk about what they are and how they differ around the world. And we'll see that as frustrating as they can be, political parties are essential for the functioning of a healthy democracy. Finally, we'll get a sense for why some democracies have many political parties, whereas others have just two. And we'll consider the relative advantages and disadvantages of two- and multi-party democracies. But first, what are political parties? And what do these strange institutions do that make them so reviled and yet such important features of the political landscape? Political parties are organizations that attempt to gain and maintain political power and to influence public policy, usually by participating in elections or by helping their members attain political office. Now, you'll notice that I say usually. And that's because campaigning for office and winning elections, that's what political parties do in stable, functioning democracies. But in dysfunctional states and dictatorships, political influence is sometimes achieved by other means, like violence or intimidation. And political parties play an important role in places like that, too. Take, for example, Hamas, which is a political party that operates in the Palestinian territories. Hamas advocates for Palestinian sovereignty and also for the Palestinian Authority to adopt stricter Islamist political policies. But Hamas also has a military wing. If elections don't go your way, or if you want to make sure that they do go your way, it's helpful to have an armed militia. That way you can provide security for your members, intimidate opponents, or carry out actions on behalf of your supporters. In fact, in places with weak or dysfunctional governments like the Palestinian territories, political parties often step in and perform the functions that a government normally would. They build schools and hospitals, and they provide security and even collect the trash. And they basically do the things that the real government either can't or won't do. And they do this at least in part with the resources they collect, either in the form of taxes, which is what you might call it if you support their activities, or extortion, which is what you'd call it if you don't. It turns out that the difference between extortion and taxation is kind of like the difference between terrorists and freedom fighters. From the outside, the activities look the same. The difference is a matter of perspective. And so, especially in places where democratic institutions are weak or non-existent, political parties often have associated or at least closely allied security forces. The Nazis had the brown shirts. The African National Congress in South Africa had a group called the Spear of the Nation. And in Northern Ireland, the nationalist movement known as Sinn Féin had the Provisional IRA, the Irish Republican Army. And to steal a phrase from Sinn Féin's strategy book, these organizations aim to represent their supporters with a ballot paper in one hand and a machine gun in the other. Political parties also play an important role in authoritarian regimes, that is to say, in countries that have functional but non-democratic governments. Cuba, Venezuela, China, Nazi Germany, and the former Soviet Union, these were all party dictatorships or one-party states. In places like this, political parties often become recruiting, training, and propaganda organs of the dictatorship itself. Let's face it, the same tools that political parties use to win elections, advertising, persuading, even educating the public, well, those same tools are also important things for dictators to use once they've attained political power. But of course, when we talk about political parties, we're usually thinking about organizations that compete for power in the context of a stable democracy, in elections and campaigns, and in the houses and halls of legislative assemblies. Democracy is about competition, and so too are political parties. And that's what we're going to focus on today. So what role do political parties play in a modern democracy? Well, for one thing, political parties help the electorate make informed decisions. Let's face it, we're all busy. We have things to do. And sometimes we don't have time to follow politics as closely as we might otherwise want. Well, it turns out that political parties help us make accurate political decisions. That is, decisions that actually represent our views. And they do this by acting as a kind of shorthand or abbreviation for what our representatives stand for. For example, when I vote for a minor political office, I might not know a lot about John Doe's particular views on this or that political issue. But next to John Doe's name on the ballot, I'll often see an R or a D, signifying that he's a Republican or a Democrat. And this helps me know if I'm likely to share John Doe's views, even if I don't know much about him as an individual. I don't know what John Doe stands for, but I do know what most Democrats stand for. And so when I see that little D next to his name, I can make a pretty good guess as to whether or not I want to support him. And no, it's not 100%. Like any abbreviation, you lose a little information when you vote strictly along party lines. But it's a lot better than a random guess. And so for down ballot races, that little R or D can be a helpful piece of information. Political parties also help people coordinate their efforts with other people who have similar political views. This is important because sometimes what you do is dependent not just on what you yourself want, but on what you think other people are likely to do. Let's say that at the start of a presidential election, you had one right-wing candidate and dozens of left-wing candidates. If you don't have political parties, if each of those left-wing candidates ran as an individual, well, they'd be competing with each other for votes on the ballot from the liberal end of the spectrum. And doing that might unintentionally hand victory over to the other side. In that case, the right-wing candidate would win, not because he or she had more support, but instead because the left-wing candidates couldn't coordinate their actions and decide which one of them should run. That's why it's usually advantageous for people on the same side of the political spectrum to form an organization, a political party that, broadly speaking, represents the views that they have in common and which has certain procedures for deciding who among them is going to run. That way, the candidates can compete with one another before the general election, but then pick a single nominee. And everybody else can get behind that nominee and give that person a real chance of beating the other side. In the United States, this preliminary process is called a party primary. And it's a very public process, one that gives ordinary citizens a lot of say in each party's eventual nominee. But in many other democracies, the process is more closed, and the selection of a party's nominee is really done by the card-carrying members of that political party, often at a party convention or meeting. This difference has received a lot of attention in recent years. The closed nature of most other countries' nominee selection process gives establishment candidates there a real advantage. But because it's much more open and public, party primaries in the United States sometimes allow outsiders and relative newcomers to appeal directly to the electorate, bypassing the establishment figures who have more clout within the party bureaucracy. Now, whether you think this is a good thing or a bad thing is up to you. But it's fair to say that if the U.S. used a less public method of selecting nominees, An outsider like Donald Trump would have been very unlikely to secure the Republican Party nomination in 2016. The larger point to keep in mind is that political parties serve an important function. By providing a process for people to pick a common nominee or set of nominees, people with similar political views can avoid competing with one another and thereby increase the chances that their views will win representation. Once in office, political parties also promote stability and open up possibilities for compromise. If a legislature consisted of 100 individuals rather than just a handful of political parties, it's hard to see where the process of negotiation would even begin. It'd be a complete free-for-all. But political parties allow the members of a legislature, and thus the political factions in society, to negotiate, to form coalitions, and to make deals as a smaller number of voting blocs. As chaotic as democracy sometimes is, imagine how much worse it would be if the debate wasn't among a handful of political parties, but a free-for-all among hundreds of individuals in an assembly. So it can be very good, and even a sign of democratic health, for a country to have stable political parties, with coherent policy platforms and a process for picking nominees. And I know that this is a tough argument to make at a time when political parties and knee-jerk partisanship seem to be tearing countries apart. But just as too much partisanship can lead to tribalism, too little partisanship can make the electoral process and even the governing process a complete mess. That's why partisanship, taken in moderation, can be a sign of political health. All right, so if that's why political parties emerge, why do more political parties emerge in some countries compared to others? Why does the United States have just 2 dominant political parties, whereas Germany has 5 or 6, and places like the Netherlands or Israel have dozens, each with a realistic shot of winning parliamentary seats and serving in a ruling coalition? Well, in a way, that's part of the answer right there: coalition politics. In a place like the United States, where there's a single and very powerful president, most people don't want to vote for a third party, even if they like what it stands for, because there's only going to be one president, and voting for a third-party candidate can feel like throwing away your vote. But if there's a realistic chance of coalition politics, of a prime minister building a coalition of a few political parties, well, in that case, the situation is a little different. Now, voting for a minor party isn't throwing away your vote, because a small party, even if it can't win the prime ministership, can still play a meaningful role in the governing coalition. This is just one of the reasons you're more likely to see multi-party politics in parliamentary political systems and two-party politics in presidential systems. A similar thing happens at the local level, and this can be another reason why some systems have a tendency to see the development of just 2 competitive political parties, rather than many. In the United States and in the United Kingdom and in a handful of other countries, we generally have 1 parliamentary or 1 congressional representative per district. Everyone in the United States has 1 and only 1 representative in the House of Representatives, unless you live in Washington, D.C., in which case you have 0. But you could imagine a system where each legislative district had, say, 2 or 3 representatives, or even more, all of whom run for office at the same time. And it turns out that having multiple representatives per district also tends to enhance the number of competitive political parties. Let's say you had a legislature with 200 members, but only 100 districts, with each district electing 2 representatives. We call these multi-member districts rather than single-member districts. Notice how, in that case, voters no longer feel penalized for voting for third parties. Your third-party vote might be enough to put your preferred candidate in second place rather than third. And in a 2-member district, that would be enough for that person to win a seat. So in comparative politics, we see a clear trend, first discovered by the late political scientist Maurice Duverger, and therefore it's called Duverger's law. And this trend suggests that single-member districts will usually give rise to the creation of just two dominant political parties. Whereas when the number of representatives per district goes up, so too does the number of competitive political parties. For good or for ill, the use of single-member districts is yet another reason why the US and the UK seem stuck with their two-party dominant system. In fact, there are political systems where voters vote for political parties rather than individual candidates. And these voting systems also tend to increase the number of political parties, sometimes quite dramatically. These are called party list election systems, and they're used in a lot of the world's multi-party democracies: Italy, Spain, Portugal, Israel, and in a host of newer democracies in Eastern Europe: Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and so on. And they use a close variant of this system in the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Scandinavia. The thing with party list voting systems is that they're perfectly proportional. Voters vote for a party, not a person. And then whatever percentage of the votes that party gets, that's how many seats the party gets in the legislature. This kind of radical proportionality has a tremendous effect on the party system, and thus on the character of democracy more generally. Think about it. A political party that gets just 6% of the vote, well, in a list system, will now get about 6% of the seats. This wouldn't be enough to win the top job like the prime ministership, but it might be enough to get a place in the ruling coalition. Contrast this with a single winner district, where a tiny political party probably wouldn't win anything at all. Moreover, these political parties aren't just small, they're often specialized and focused on a narrow set of issues. Let's face it, if you only have to win a few percentage points to get seats in Parliament, you can afford to cater to a pretty narrow slice of the electorate. But despite their small size and narrow focus, minor political parties can wield tremendous influence. Take a case like the Netherlands, which uses a variant of the party list system, and which consistently has a dozen or so political parties in its House of Representatives. And to give you a sense for how narrowly tailored these parties can be, there's an animal rights party, in addition to two Green parties. And there's a 50-plus party, which advocates for pensioners and retirees. You see what I mean by catering to relatively small segments of the electorate. And sure, some of these parties only have a few seats each. But there are so many political parties and the votes are so spread out that even the major parties only have 20 or 30% of the seats. This means that the bigger political parties need the smaller ones in order to get a majority and to get anything done. In the Netherlands, you're usually not going to be able to form a government or to pass laws without a handful of parties in your coalition, whatever's necessary to get you past the 50% mark. In a multi-party democracy, tiny political parties can have disproportionate influence. What's important to remember is that the number of political parties has only a little bit to do with how divided or fractured a society is. Parties can factionalize or divide, or they can coalesce and merge around a broader set of interests. But this isn't really a function of how factionalized society is or of how many interest groups there are. Instead, it reflects the ways that votes are counted and that seats are filled. Or it's a function of the government formation process and the capacity for coalitions. The United States has two dominant political parties, not because people necessarily want it that way, but rather because the way we hold elections disincentivizes us from voting for small political parties, for fear that we'll be throwing away our vote. If the United States had parliamentary coalitions and party list voting, new political parties would almost certainly emerge. And if the Netherlands went to majority voting, the parties there would likely consolidate, knowing that if they don't get a sizable chunk of the electorate, they might not get anything at all. Okay, but is that something we should want? Is the multi-party system really better? Well, not necessarily. It's true that a lot of people find the multi-party system appealing. They like that it's proportional, They say it promotes broader coalitions and provides more opportunity for compromise and consensus. Most of all, they like that it gives voters a lot of choice. You're a socially conservative tree hugger? There's probably a party for you. You want less regulation in the economy, but also legalized marijuana? That's what the Libertarian Party is for, and in a multi-party system, they have a realistic chance. I was talking to a friend just the other day. This person describes herself as a social justice Catholic. Among other things, she wants to see restrictions on abortion, but she also opposes the death penalty. What's more, she wants to see the government fund private religious schools, which her kids attend, but she also wants to see more public support for the poor and for immigrants. And I had news for her. In the current two-party system, she's bound to be disappointed. Right now, there just isn't a political party in the United States that represents the full complement of her political interests. Multi-party systems, on the other hand, give voters more choice. With a dozen political parties, you're more likely to find a group that represents your particular combination of political interests. Or you might even find one political party that represents the narrow set of issues about which you're particularly passionate. That's probably why multi-party systems usually have higher voter turnout and higher levels of engagement than two-party systems. The relative lack of choice in a two-party system can lead to apathy. People get tired of compromising their values and of voting for what they see as the lesser of two evils. In multi-party systems, political parties can get away with catering to a small but passionate subset of the electorate, and this has a way of enhancing political participation. Still, the multi-party system's greatest assets, diversity of representation, proportionality, and choice, these things are also its biggest liabilities. The problem with giving everyone a choice is that you also give everyone a voice. For every 50-plus political party that caters to pensioners and every Green Party that caters to environmentalists, there's probably a communist party or a fascist party or a party with fringe extremists that want to put an end to the democratic system itself. The German Nazis rose to prominence in a highly factionalized multi-party democracy. And I think that's why people today are so wary of seeing small populist political movements of the right and the left gaining political power. Extremist views often start off as fringe views. And just as the multi-party system gives small factions disproportionate influence, it also gives them a stage and a path to enter the mainstream. We see this in the multi-party parliaments of Hungary and Poland, Greece and Spain, Austria and Germany, and even in the Netherlands, one of the oldest and most stable democracies in the world. When political parties represent narrow segments of society, they have a tendency to represent extremist segments of society. But then again, no political system is perfect. The two-party system can promote gridlock and us-them thinking, and that too offers a sad path to democratic decay. Ultimately, two-party and multi-party democracies both come with risks and rewards. The choice of which is better remains one of the enduring questions of comparative politics.